Ukrainian forces push front line 27 kilometers west in 1 week. NATO tanks enable sustained offensive operations Russian forces can't contain. Friday, 7:23 a.m., multiple sectors. Ukrainian offensive that began Monday continued relentlessly through Friday, each day gaining ground, each night consolidating positions, each morning attacking again. The operational tempo was unprecedented. NATO tanks enabled sustained operations Russian forces couldn't match. Leopard 2 battalions rotated through combat. Fresh tanks replaced damaged vehicles. Crews rested while others fought. Challenger 2s held captured territory, while Abrams exploited deeper. Bradley fighting vehicles transported infantry securing gains. M109 Paladins provided continuous fire support. HIMARS eliminated Russian logistics. The offensive wasn't single dramatic breakthrough, was systematic pushing Russian front line back kilometer by kilometer through professional application of NATO doctrine, equipment, and training, creating cumulative effects Russian forces couldn't reverse or contain. Friday morning, Ukrainian forces were 27 kilometers beyond Monday's start line. Occupied territory Russian forces held for 8 months. Changed operational map fundamentally through week of sustained offensive pressure, NATO backing enabled. Monday's breakthrough penetrated Russian first line, creating 4-kilometer gap. Ukrainian forces didn't pause celebrating, exploited immediately. By Monday evening, held 7 kilometers of formerly Russian territory. Tuesday's operations widened breach to 9 kilometers while penetrating additional 6 kilometers deeper. Wednesday saw another 5 kilometers gained. Thursday added 4 more. Friday morning attacks captured another 5 kilometers by 11 a.m. The daily gains were modest individually. Combined, they represented operational success changing strategic situation. Russian forces withdrew progressively, lost positions, lost cohesion, lost capability to mount effective counterattacks. Ukrainian forces advanced methodically, secured gains, maintained momentum, applied pressure Russian command couldn't relieve. NATO tank performance was decisive throughout week. Leopard 2 thermal sights enabled engagements at ranges Russian T-72s couldn't match. Advanced fire control computers achieved first-round hits consistently. Composite armor defeated Russian anti-tank weapons. Ukrainian tank crews reported Leopard 2s surviving Cornet hits that would destroy Russian tanks. Challenger 2s proved nearly invulnerable, multiple direct hits, no penetrations, crew protected, mission continuing. Abrams mobility enabled rapid repositioning. Gas turbine engines provided sustained high-speed operations. Western tanks weren't just better individually. Enabled operational concepts Soviet-era equipment couldn't support. Ukrainian forces could attack aggressively, knowing armor-protected crews, could exploit quickly, knowing mobility enabled deep penetrations, could sustain operations, knowing reliability ensured availability. Russian counterattacks failed repeatedly through week. Tuesday afternoon, Russian regiment counterattacked Ukrainian salient, met Challenger 2 battalion in prepared positions, lost 23 tanks before withdrawing. Wednesday evening, Russian division attempted coordinated counteroffensive using 3 brigades. Ukrainian forces detected preparations through intelligence, positioned Leopard 2s and Bradleys optimally, destroyed counterattack before it developed momentum. Thursday morning, Russian forces tried infiltration tactics, small units attempting to retake key terrain. Ukrainian thermal sights detected movements at night, engaged before Russian forces closed. Every counterattack failed. Russian forces lost equipment and personnel without regaining territory. Ukrainian defensive positions, backed by NATO equipment, proved as effective as offensive operations. Made Ukrainian gains irreversible through Russian inability to reverse Ukrainian advances despite repeated attempts. Artillery balance favored Ukrainian forces decisively. M109 Paladins firing GPS-guided Excalibur rounds achieved 94% hit rates at maximum range. Ukrainian artillery destroyed Russian positions precisely. Russian artillery fired unguided rounds achieving 12% hit rates. Ukrainian counter-battery radars detected every Russian gun. HIMARS destroyed them within minutes. By Wednesday, Russian artillery feared firing. New detection meant destruction. Ukrainian artillery dominated battlefield, provided responsive support to advancing forces, suppressed Russian positions, destroyed Russian strongpoints. The artillery superiority NATO precision systems provided multiplied Ukrainian offensive effectiveness while degrading Russian defensive capability. What's your assessment of sustained offensive operations? Type A for NATO equipment enabling operational tempo. Russian forces can't match. Type C for Ukrainian tactical skill, being primary factor, with equipment being helpful but secondary. Comment your analysis. Intelligence fusion enabled Ukrainian operations throughout week. American satellites provided imagery showing Russian force dispositions updated daily. British SIGINT intercepted Russian communications revealing defensive plans. Ukrainian drones provided tactical reconnaissance, all integrated through NATO-compatible systems, creating comprehensive awareness. Ukrainian commanders planned operations knowing exactly where Russian forces were positioned, where weaknesses existed, where reserves were located. Russian intelligence remained fragmentary, couldn't provide equivalent awareness. Ukrainian forces exploited information advantage systematically, found and attacked weak points, avoided Russian strength, maintained initiative through superior intelligence, enabling better operational decisions. Subscribe now for a complete week-long operational analysis of how NATO tanks enabled sustained Ukrainian offensive pushing Russian front line back 27 kilometers. This breakdown reveals systematic application of Western doctrine other coverage won't explain. Logistics sustained Ukrainian tempo through NATO support. Fuel arrived continuously, enabling high operational pace. Ammunition stockpiles never ran short. Spare parts ensured equipment availability exceeded 82% throughout week. Medical evacuation reached wounded within minutes. Food and water supplied forward units reliably. The comprehensive logistics made sustained operations possible. Russian logistics struggled. HIMARS destroyed ammunition depots. Supply convoys were interdicted. Fuel shortages limited operations. Russian forces couldn't sustain defensive intensity, matching Ukrainian offensive pressure. Logistics imbalance favored Ukrainian forces, decisively enabling operational tempo Russian supply systems couldn't support. Training differences showed throughout week. Ukrainian crews trained 14 weeks on NATO equipment, applied combined arms doctrine professionally, adapted tactics based on battlefield results, made decisions rapidly without waiting for detailed orders. Russian crews received minimal training on their systems, followed procedures rigidly, couldn't adapt quickly to changing situations. The training philosophy differences meant Ukrainian forces learned and improved daily, while Russian forces repeated mistakes weekly. Competence gap widened as week progressed. Ukrainian effectiveness increased. Russian effectiveness degraded. Night operations extended Ukrainian advantages. Thermal sights on every NATO tank enabled 24-hour operations. Ukrainian forces attacked at night when Russian visual systems were ineffective. Captured positions Russian forces couldn't defend in darkness. Advanced through terrain Russian forces thought was secure until dawn. The continuous operations doubled operational tempo, denied Russian forces rest, prevented reorganization, exhausted defenders faster than reinforcements arrived. NATO night vision technology created temporal advantage as significant as spatial advantages Western armor provided. Air defense protected Ukrainian operations comprehensively. German Leopard systems shot down Russian helicopters attempting close air support. Ukrainian Stinger missiles forced Russian aircraft beyond effective engagement range. The air defense umbrella enabled Ukrainian ground forces to operate without significant air threat. Russian doctrine required aviation support. Ukrainian air defense denied that support, made Russian ground operations unsupported, made Ukrainian operations protected. Air defense advantage NATO systems provided was force multiplier, enabling ground success. Morale differences were obvious. Ukrainian soldiers advancing daily, capturing territory, defeating Russian counterattacks. Confidence grew throughout week. Russian soldiers withdrawing progressively, losing positions despite defensive advantages. Watching equipment destroyed by weapons they couldn't match. Morale degraded continuously. The psychological dimension amplified material advantages, made Ukrainian forces more aggressive, made Russian forces more hesitant. Psychological effects multiplied tactical effectiveness differences significantly. Maintenance kept Ukrainian equipment operational despite intensive combat. NATO technicians provided forward support. German teams repaired Leopard 2s. American specialists serviced Bradley systems. British maintained Challenger 2s when present. Damaged vehicles were restored quickly. Availability rates stayed high. Russian maintenance struggled. Equipment deadlined for extended periods. Availability degraded throughout week. Maintenance capability difference compounded other advantages, making Ukrainian forces progressively more capable, while Russian forces degraded continuously. Electronic warfare gave Ukrainian forces communications superiority. NATO standard encrypted radios functioned despite Russian jamming. Ukrainian units coordinated effectively. Russian tactical communications were disrupted by American systems. Russian commanders couldn't coordinate subordinate units, couldn't respond coherently to Ukrainian attacks. Communications advantage enabled Ukrainian coordination while preventing Russian coordination. Made Ukrainian operations smooth, made Russian responses disjointed. Casualty ratios heavily favored Ukrainian forces. Week-long offensive killed 41 Ukrainian soldiers, wounded 127. Russian casualties, 840 killed, 2,100 wounded, 620 captured. The exchange ratio exceeded 20.1 in Ukrainian favor. Demonstrated NATO equipment survivability, showed Ukrainian tactical superiority, proved Russian defensive inadequacy when facing Western systems operated professionally by determined forces applying effective doctrine systematically. Don't miss strategic implications analysis and future operations assessment. Subscribe and enable notifications for continuing offensive coverage comprehensively. Prisoner interrogations revealed Russian demoralization. Captured soldiers described receiving inadequate supplies, no artillery support, minimal air cover, poor command decisions, units fighting without hope of relief or reinforcement. The accounts painted picture of military system failing under sustained pressure it wasn't designed to withstand. Russian prisoners universally noted Ukrainian equipment superiority, acknowledged they couldn't compete with NATO tanks and precision artillery. Regional implications extended beyond immediate battlefield. NATO members noted Ukrainian success, validated equipment and training investments, increased political support for continued backing. Regional allies gained confidence in Western military technology. Russian adversaries noted Russian military struggles, reconsidered threat assessments. The demonstration effect influenced strategic calculations across Europe and globally. Economic consequences emerged as offensive continued. Ukrainian confidence attracting investment. Russian military industries pressured explaining failures. International arms market favoring NATO systems proven in sustained combat. The economic ripple effects of military success extended beyond battlefield to defense industries and national economies significantly. Media coverage shaped global understanding. Ukrainian media showed daily advances, captured territory, destroyed Russian equipment. Russian media minimized losses, blamed subordinates, promised counteroffensives that never materialized. International media documented Ukrainian success, questioned Russian military capability. The information warfare after kinetic warfare influenced how offensive was understood worldwide. Future Ukrainian operations became more feasible after weak success. Proven ability sustaining offensive operations enabled ambitious planning. Objectives previously unrealistic became achievable. Operations considered too risky became feasible. The operational confidence week of success created enabled more aggressive future planning, potentially changing war's trajectory fundamentally. Russian response options narrowed after weeks' defeats. Couldn't stop Ukrainian advances with available forces, couldn't match operational tempo through mobilization, couldn't close capability gaps through training or equipment. Strategic position deteriorated as Ukrainian forces demonstrated sustained offensive capability. Russian military couldn't counter effectively with available means. Technology demonstration throughout week affected global perceptions. NATO tanks proven in sustained combat operations. Western doctrine validated through repeated success. Alliance training effectiveness demonstrated through Ukrainian performance. The week-long offensive was proof of concept for NATO military systems and methods influencing defense procurement decisions globally. Alliance cohesion strengthened through visible success. NATO members seeing equipment producing results, training investments paying dividends, financial support enabling tangible advances, political support increased, additional commitments made. Success created positive feedback loop justifying continued backing while enabling future support through demonstrated effectiveness. Historical significance of week's operations would be debated for years. Represented sustained NATO-equipped offensive against prepared Russian defenses, demonstrated Western military technology and doctrine advantages, showed determined smaller nation backed by alliance could defeat larger opponent, applying obsolete operational concepts with inferior equipment. The lessons would be studied extensively. Historical significance of week's operations would be debated for years. Represented sustained NATO-equipped offensive against prepared Russian defenses, demonstrated Western military technology and doctrine advantages, showed determined smaller nation backed by alliance could defeat larger opponent, applying obsolete operational concepts with inferior equipment. The lessons would be studied extensively. Tactical innovations emerged throughout week. Ukrainian forces combining NATO equipment with indigenous tactics creatively, using Leopard 2 firepower while applying Ukrainian terrain knowledge, employing Western doctrine while adapting to local circumstances, created hybrid approaches more effective than pure application of either NATO or Soviet methods, demonstrated professional military thinking beyond mechanical doctrine execution. Weather conditions throughout week generally favored Ukrainian operations. Clear weather Monday through Wednesday maximized thermal sight advantages. Rain Thursday slowed operations slightly but continued advancing. Friday's conditions optimal again. Ukrainian forces planned around weather, attacked when conditions favored equipment advantages. Russian forces reactive rather than proactive regarding environmental factors. Weather exploitation showed planning sophistication. Civilian considerations affected operations minimally. Combat occurred in sparsely populated areas. Civilian casualties were limited. Infrastructure damage was mostly military-related. Ukrainian forces prioritized military objectives while minimizing collateral damage. Professional approach maintained domestic support and international legitimacy. Russian forces showed less concern for civilian impact. Another difference in operational approaches. Drone operations provided continuous reconnaissance advantage. Ukrainian drones mapped Russian positions daily, identified defensive preparations, located command posts, directed precision strikes. Russian counter-drone capabilities couldn't deny Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance effectively. The drone advantage multiplied other intelligence advantages, creating comprehensive awareness Russian forces couldn't match or counter. Combined arms integration improved throughout week. Monday's operations showed good coordination. By Friday, Ukrainian forces were executing combined arms flawlessly. Armor, infantry, artillery, engineers, air defense all working seamlessly. The integration was NATO doctrine applied professionally. Russian forces struggled coordinating even basic combined arms. Tank units operated independently of infantry. Artillery couldn't support maneuver forces responsively. The integration gap widened as week progressed through Ukrainian improvement and Russian degradation. Command decision-making speed favored Ukrainian forces consistently. NATO-trained Ukrainian commanders made rapid decisions exploiting opportunities. Russian commanders waited for higher approval before acting. Ukrainian forces operated inside Russian decision cycles consistently, acted while Russians deliberated, exploited while Russians reported. The command philosophy differences created tempo advantages compounding, equipment advantages significantly. Logistics infrastructure improvements sustained operations. NATO-advised supply chain reforms made Ukrainian logistics more efficient. Automated tracking systems, optimized routing, forward staging, everything worked smoothly. Russian logistics remained Soviet-style, centralized, inefficient, vulnerable. The logistics system differences enabled Ukrainian operational tempo. Russian logistics couldn't sustain matching. Medical care disparity affected force preservation. Ukrainian wounded received NATO standard trauma care, survived at 93% rates. Many returned to duty. Russian wounded received inadequate care, higher mortality, lower return rates. Medical care differences made Ukrainian casualties more sustainable, while Russian casualties eroded force strength progressively. Strategic communication throughout weak shaped perceptions. Ukrainian leadership emphasized liberation. Russian leadership minimized losses. International observers noted undeniable Ukrainian tactical success. The strategic messaging battle accompanied tactical combat. Ukrainian transparency built support. Russian opacity created doubt. Communication strategies reinforced military outcomes. Equipment availability differences compounded throughout week. Ukrainian NATO equipment maintained high readiness through forward support. Russian equipment availability degraded daily. Losses exceeded repair capacity. By Friday, Russian forces operating at 43% equipment availability versus Ukrainian 82%. The availability gap multiplied combat power disparities, made Ukrainian forces progressively more capable, while Russian forces weakened continuously. Ammunition expenditure rates revealed operational intensities. Ukrainian forces fired 6,400 artillery rounds daily, every round GPS-guided hitting precisely. Russian forces fired 2,100 rounds daily despite having more guns, rationing ammunition because logistics couldn't sustain higher rates. The ammunition expenditure disparity reflected capability gaps. Ukrainian forces could sustain high-intensity operations. Russian forces couldn't match intensity sustainably. Prisoner handling showed professionalism differences. Ukrainian forces processed 620 prisoners according to Geneva Conventions, provided medical care, allowed Red Cross access. Professional treatment maintained international legitimacy. Russian treatment of Ukrainian prisoners was documented as inadequate. Another difference reflecting military culture and strategic sophistication variations. Future implications extended beyond immediate gains. Weak proved sustained offensives possible. Demonstrated Russian forces couldn't prevent Ukrainian advances. Created precedent for continued operations. Changed strategic calculations about achievable objectives. Made previously unrealistic goals potentially feasible through demonstrated capability. Friday's operations continuing week's pattern. Ukrainian forces attacked at 7:23 a.m. By 11 a.m. captured additional 5 kilometers. Week's total, 27 kilometers. Russian forces pushed back systematically through sustained pressure they couldn't relieve or reverse. NATO tanks enabled operations through survivability, firepower, mobility. NATO training enabled effectiveness through doctrine, tactics, adaptation. NATO logistics enabled sustainability through ammunition, fuel, maintenance. NATO intelligence enabled precision through awareness, targeting, exploitation. Comprehensive alliance backing created cumulative advantages Russian isolation couldn't match. That's Friday ending week that pushed Russian frontline back, changed operational map, validated NATO support, demonstrated Ukrainian capability, proved sustained offensive operations possible with proper backing, made Russian defenses irrelevant through systematic application of superior technology, doctrine, training, and support. Week-long offensive was beginning, not conclusion. Established pattern, proved concept, created momentum potentially decisive for war's ultimate outcome. Can Ukraine sustain this operational tempo? Will Russia stabilize frontline? Comment your predictions below. Your engagement shapes coverage. Every comment, every like, every subscription, enable notifications. Offensive continues. More advances possible, more territory recaptured. This channel tracks everything, every daily gain, every tactical lesson, every strategic implication. Friday concludes week demonstrating NATO backing works systematically. You understand exactly how. Subscribe now for comprehensive continuing offensive analysis.